Good afternoon. I'm Gretchen Schuler, the president of the Whalen Historical Society, and this is our second program this year. We are partnering with the Whalen Free Public Library, and thanks to Courtney Michael of the library, I've just been able to sit back and get ready for this, and she's done all the hard work of the advertising as well as getting your emails and letting you into the seminar. So I would like to start by saying most of you know that the Whalen Historical Society, the Whalen Museum and Historical Society, is a membership-based organization, although we are quite open to the public, as is this seminar. And we do depend upon your dues. And so we would welcome you as a member, as a returning member or a new member at any time. And all the information is on our website, whalenmuseum.org. And I'd also like to say that Courtney reached out to neighborhood libraries in the general Minuteman coalition. And we have 3 libraries that have many people attending from their communities: Tewksbury and Maynard and Lunenburg. I believe are the 3 that said, yes, we'd love to have this program be part of our programs. And I think Tewksbury has almost as many people attending as Whalen does. So thank you very much for that. The program is being recorded and will eventually be on the Whalen Museum and Historical Society website. And it will, I think they're on the library website. Is that right, Courtney?
Yes.
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 Yeah. Okay, fine. Thank you. So that will not happen immediately, but it will happen sometime in the near future. So without any further ado, I'd like to introduce you to our speaker today is Catherine Musemeche. She is an author. She's a graduate of the University of Texas McGovern Medical School and also the University of Texas School of Law. She's been a pediatric surgeon for decades and has written books as well about her experiences gained from her medical practice. But now this one, and I can't wait to find out why, and this is a quote from her publicist: "The gripping story of an unsung woman who had a dramatic effect on the U.S. Navy's success during World War II in the Pacific Theater." So before I welcome Catherine, I'd like to just say that I had one email that I'm going to read to you from a friend a couple weeks ago. I received this email and it said, quote, "I got Lethal Tides and read it in 2 days. So well written, difficult to write nonfiction like a novel." So I hope that will encourage you to get a copy of the book. I did get one and I have read it, and I have so many questions. So that was one other thing. If you have any questions, use the chat box, put them there, and when Catherine is finished, we will I will field the questions to her. So with no further ado, Catherine, the stage is yours. Thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you, Gretchen, and I want to thank the Whalen Historical Society for sponsoring this event this afternoon. And I want to give a special thanks to your curator, Kay Gardner-Westcott, who helped me with the research for this book. And I just drove her completely crazy with my emails, and she was very patient with me. I also want to thank the Whalen Public Library and Courtney Michael for co-sponsoring the event today. It's just a real pleasure to be able to address people who live in Mary Sears' hometown. So let me just say that when I started reading about Mary Sears, I would go to the library or to the local bookstore, and I would go to where the World War II books were, and I would pull off from the shelf all the books that had the words tides, waves, anything about amphibious landings, and I would flip to the index in the back, and I would look for the word oceanography, and I could never find it. Nor could I find the name Mary Sears in these indices, and that told me that this story needed to be brought to a larger audience. So that is part of what brought us here today. Our story begins with Pearl Harbor, December 7th, 1941, when the Japanese attacked our bases there. Not only did they injure or kill 3,500 men, but they also damaged or destroyed 19 of our ships. They were intending to deal our Navy a fatal blow, but that did not happen. The Japanese had forced us to act and to declare war before we were ready to. But as President Roosevelt confided to his wife, Eleanor, he really didn't know how he would go about fighting across two oceans with such a severe shortage of ships. He could only hope to stave off disaster while American shipbuilders built more. As I mentioned, the United States was suddenly thrust into this two-ocean war. We had already been busy in the Atlantic Ocean, helping to escort and defend merchant shipping from German U-boats attacks. But all of a sudden, we had to another ocean to battle in, the vast Pacific Ocean with its 64 million square miles of ocean. And this is the largest ocean on Earth, and it was an ocean that we knew very little about. And there was a huge difference between World War I and World War II and the role that the ocean would play. In World War I, men would sail over to friendly harbors and they would be greeted and they could stand around and have a cigarette and chat with their friends and then make their way to the front. In World War II, it was a very different situation. No one would be rolling out welcome mats to the troops then, especially in the Pacific, where every battle to capture a strategic target would be met by fierce opposition at the shoreline. So we had to battle our way actually onto shore in World War II. Where was Mary Sears when World War II began? Well, she was actually off the coast of Peru, sailing around in Pisco Bay. And she was there because she had been invited to go over there by an ornithologist. It seemed that the guano birds, who were responsible for the richest fertilizer in the world, a very important crop for the Peruvian economy, the guano bird population was waning, and you can see it was in the millions at its peak there in 1907. And Mary Sears had been asked to come over there and study what was going on with the anchovies that the guano birds fed on. And the anchovies fed on plankton, and that was Mary Sears' specialty, the study of plankton. So Sears undertook this journey to Pisco Bay on the verge of wartime, a very dangerous mission. And the reason she did this is because women were not allowed on overnight expeditions in the United States, women scientists. So she knew if she didn't take this opportunity to go over to Peru, it might be a very long time before she had another opportunity. And she was right, of course. Well, who was this gritty individual and where had she come from? Well, as you all know, she had come from Wayland, Massachusetts, where she had very deep roots. Her great-grandfather, Edmund Hamilton Sears, the Reverend Edmund Hamilton Sears, was a well-known minister in town. He had written 500 hymns, including It Came Upon the Midnight Clear, which was later adapted to become a Christmas carol called It Came Upon a Midnight Clear. You're going to hear a lot of Edmonds in this sequence. Mary Sears' father, Edmund H. Sears II, married her mother, Leslie Buckingham, and they spent their part of the year in Whalen at what was called the old Buckingham place, which had been Mary Sears' parents' house. And they spent the other part of the year in Boston, where Edmund was a textile merchant. Unfortunately, tragedy struck the young family when Leslie Sears came down with polio, and this affected her respiratory system, and she died when Mary Sears was only 6 years old. And this is another great photograph from the Whalen Historical Society, and I believe this was taken by Mary's uncle, Alfred Whalen Cutting, who was quite the photographer there around town, and took a lot of nature scenes and so forth. But this is the young Mary Sears, her brother Edmund or Ned, and her little sister Kit. And they were riding around in a horse and buggy at that time. Now, Mary Sears went to what we might call today middle school and high school at the Windsor School in Boston. This is Mary Sears right here on the edge in this photo. And it turned out that her father married her homeroom teacher here at the Windsor School, named Sophie Bennett. I'm not sure where Mary went to school before grade 5. She was there from grades 5 through 12. But if anybody knows for sure where Mary Sears went to school from grades 1 to 4, please get in touch with me and I will send you a signed copy of my book, because I have been looking everywhere to nail down that information. So Mary Sears, from Windsor, she went to Radcliffe. And at first she was going to study the classics. Her father had been a Greek scholar and she wanted to study Greek as well. But her mother, Sophie Bennett, encouraged Mary to take a science course, take something different. And Mary did take a science course with a preeminent professor named Parker. And after that first course, she said she was hooked on science. And you can see in her transcript after that, she would take like 5 science classes at a time. And she became a very accomplished researcher while she was at Radcliffe. And she met a mentor, Henry Bryant Bigelow, who took Mary under his wing. He was a planktonologist and probably the preeminent marine biologist of our times. And he would take Mary Sears to Woods Hole in the summer. And in the winter, when he went back to Harvard, she would resume her studies at Radcliffe and help him with his research there. So she started early in this field and became very well known because of her association with Henry Bryant Bigelow. This 2 ocean war that I talked about just a little bit ago, the World War II, really hit the Naval Hydrographic Office hard. And this was the office in Washington, D.C. that was responsible for producing nautical charts and navigation aids. And it would be the place where oceanography would ultimately wind up. But when Admiral George Bryan took it over in 1938, he inherited what was described in the history as a relatively bad situation. There had been no increase in personnel for a number of years. They were working with outdated machinery and equipment that they used to print maps. They were badly cramped for space, and they had lost access to foreign nautical charts because of the war. So Admiral Bryan, I consider him a real hero of the war, because he kept this place together during the war, and ultimately supported the development of oceanography there. And one of the things that the Navy was grappling with, of course, just like every other agency and branch of the military, was a labor shortage. Even though there was this ready group of individuals available to step up and fill in some of the labor needs. At the outset of the war, women were not allowed to serve in any branch of the armed forces. Congress passed the first bill allowing them to serve for the Army in May of 1942. It took longer with the Navy because the Navy was considered a macho organization and it resisted allowing women to enter. But with the support, there was one female representative in Congress, Edith Norris Rogers, and the support of Eleanor Roosevelt and her husband, FDR, women were finally allowed into the Navy in 1942, and that's when the waves came into being. Initial estimates provided for about 10,000 waves, but when the Navy's Bureau of Aeronautics requested 20,000, they had to revise their estimates upward to 75,000 waves and 12,000 additional officers. And the Navy needed every one of them during World War II. And this is Mary Sears in her uniform when she first joined the Waves. And she started out as a lieutenant, junior grade, and rose through the ranks to become lieutenant commander during World War II. And her path to the Navy was not an easy one. When she finished her research in Peru, she returned to Woods Hole in March of 1942, and she found that the labs had been taken over by research projects for the Navy. She watched as one by one the men went off to war, and of course she wanted to go too, but she first had to wait for the government to allow women into the armed forces. And then as soon as she could, she applied to the Waves, but she was turned down initially because of a bout of arthritis, a very transient bout of this that probably wasn't arthritis at all. Fortuitously, a few months after she had been turned down, a Lieutenant Roger Revell, a marine geologist from Scripps Institution of Oceanography, he had been assigned to the hydrographic office part-time and to the Bureau of Ships. And he wanted to find somebody else to take his place at the hydrographic office because he saw it, he called it a dull map-making outfit. So he traveled to Woods Hole to see if he could get a replacement. So he met with the director of Woods Hole then, who was Columbus, Iceland. And he said, I need one more of your oceanographers to take this position for me. But initially, Iceland said, no, we don't have anybody. We can't give up one of our valuable staff. But after Iceland leaned on him pretty heavily, he finally said, you can have the only woman on staff who happened to be Mary Sears. She can, we can do without her during the war. So Sears, still anxious to serve, she applied and she had to get a medical waiver, but Revell helped with that. And she finally reported to duty in April of 1943, the first full-time oceanographer of the Navy. So think about that for a minute. We have been at war since December 1941, a year and a half. We've been fighting before Mary Sears was able to take her place as the first full-time oceanographer. She was joined at the Naval Hydrographic Office in the oceanographic unit by a group of people, most of whom she knew before the war. This was Finner Chase, who came from Harvard. Mary Sears had known him when he was a graduate student, and he was a hermit crab expert. And Finner had excellent illustration skills. So he joined the team and was their primary illustrator and consultant for whatever graphics they needed to come up with for the reports. Dora Henry was known as the Barnacle Lady because she was the foremost expert on barnacles in this country. And she came from, she came from the University of Washington, which also had a large oceanography department that had been shuttered during the war. This is Mary Greer, who was the nation's foremost oceanographic librarian, also from the University of Washington. And when the oceanography department was closed, Greer had to go to work at a Boeing plant in Seattle doing quality control. And after Dora Henry got to the oceanographic office, I'm sure she is the one that recommended Mary Greer be contacted. And Greer actually wound up serving a very important function during the war, because she was the team member who would go to the libraries around Washington, D.C. to get data for the oceanographic reports that the group would perform for the Navy. This was one of the more important projects that Sears worked on early on, the cloth rescue maps for downed pilots. And what happened in World War II is air travel was relatively new, so there were lots of air crashes, military air crashes. And of course, the planes would be shot down in the Pacific, which, as I mentioned before, was a huge ocean, and it could be difficult to locate them in their rafts. So these cloth rescue maps were designed to be worn around the neck of the pilot or stuffed into a pocket of their flight jacket. And these maps showed the different directions of the currents and the strengths depending on how heavy the lines were. And Finner Chase and Mary Sears worked together on these at the beginning of their tenure in the oceanographic office. And this is one of the most important projects they worked on, the bathythermograph project. And what the bathythermograph was, it was this very large, heavy, cumbersome instrument that it had been invented before the war, but it was further refined at Woods Hole. And this instrument measured the temperature versus the depth in the ocean and help identify temperature differentials that were important in locating thermoclines, where submarines could hide from enemy ships. And it had to be deployed over the side of the ship hundreds of times, lowered and reeled back in. And it had a glass slide inside here that was smoked with skunk oil. And this slide would be edged with a very primitive stylus, and then the slides would be sent back from the Pacific to the scripts on the West Coast, and from the Atlantic, they would be sent back to Woods Hole. And all this data would be collected and then forwarded on to Mary Sears, who compiled submarine directions and published this very key information and sent it out to merchant ships and Navy ships and to the submarines to use in anti-submarine warfare. After being at the hydrographic office for a few months, Sears was handed probably what was her most important project during the war, and that was compiling Chapter 3 oceanography of the Joint Army-Navy Intelligence Studies. And these studies came about because when FDR went to meetings of the combined chiefs, that is meetings with Churchill and the British Joint Chiefs and then the American Joint Chiefs, together they were called the combined chiefs. The British would always pull out these white papers, which had a lot of information about where the war was headed and information about the regions that they were considering invading. And so FDR told his Joint Chiefs to start getting reports together so that he had as much information as the British and didn't have to rely on just their information. So as strange as this might seem, that mid-war is when these reports came about, that is exactly what happened. It took 27 government agencies and 3 major intelligence agencies to produce the Joint Army-Navy Intelligence Studies. And these were meant to produce a report that under one cover would cover the geographic, physical, demographic, socioeconomic, topographic, everything, every detail that could affect a combat operation by land, sea, or air. And that's what these were. And Mary Sears became responsible for chapter 3. And the initial outline had 33 different oceanographic parameters that had to be researched and reported on. And these parameters were things like tides, waves, currents, diagrams that correlated the tidal levels with sunlight and moonlight. And these were important for the timing of invasions, particularly at dawn. They had salinity information about bottom sediments, acoustic conditions, and biological factors such as seaweed, which could foul propellers on a landing, and bioluminescence, which could illuminate ships and submarines to enemy planes overhead. So Sears took this on, and it kind of unspooled in sort of a delayed fashion, I would say, the reports. And the Janus program was still in its infancy and suffering through some growing pains when the amphibious campaign in the Pacific got underway. Consequently, Sears and her group didn't have the opportunity to prepare detailed oceanographic information for one of the major initial invasions. And this was the Battle of Tarawa, which took place. Tarawa was an atoll in the Gilbert Islands in the Pacific, and it was surrounded completely by a coral reef. And this caused some concern because the landing boats had to be able to get across the coral reef when they were going to go to shore. And the question was, would the tidal levels around Tarawa be high enough for the boats to cross the reef? So these boats were Higgins boats, and they had been developed specifically as landing craft for the Navy. Higgins boats initially were developed in the swamps of Louisiana for logging operations, so they could travel in shallow water, and they only needed a 4-foot draft. So the Navy consulted various foreign experts and locals to try to figure out what is the tidal estimate for this area, and will our boats be able to get across? And they were basically told by the experts that they should easily get 4 feet and probably more, and it wouldn't be a problem. So they did acquire a limited number of first-generation tractors just in case the boats got stuck. But this first generation of tractors was not very reliable because they had been developed just for cargo transport, not for transporting people. But at Tarawa, it was a little bit of a disaster. What happened on November 20th, 1943, the initial day of the landing, it happened to be one of 2 days in the year when a very low neap, N-E-A-P, tide occurred. It wasn't just a neap tide, it was a neap tide when the moon was in apogee, which meant that it was at its furthest point from the Earth. So there was an even narrower tidal range than would be expected with a neap tide. And as a result, the mean tidal level stayed around 3.3 feet for 48 hours. As a result, a number of landing boats were stranded on the reef, and men were forced to climb out of the boats and start wading to shore under intense sniper fire. This is an eyewitness account from Charles Pace, a 17-year-old machine gunner from West Virginia. And I obtained this from the Oral History Archives at the National Museum of the Pacific War. And here's what he said. we'd watch these lines of Marines climb out of the Higgins boats as they worked up to the reef and then try to walk ashore. And occasionally we'd see a man disappear. Then maybe 2 or 3 men away, another man would suddenly disappear and they would just drop into the water. These men were being picked off by the machine guns. And even though they had the tractors weren't faring very well. They were getting shot up and they were exploding when a bullet hit their gas tank, and it was just a complete debacle out there at Tarawa. There were high casualties. Of the 5,000 Marines in the landing force, we lost basically 3,000 to injury or death. 300 men were killed just trying to cross the barrier reef. So there were corpses strewn everywhere at Tarawa. And here are the unreliable first generation Amtrak tractors that wrecked or blew up and turned out not to be very much help at all. Well, after Tarawa, Admiral Nimitz, who was the head of the Pacific forces, visited, and of course he walked among the corpses and saw just what a wreck it was, what a debacle this operation was. Even though we had captured the island, it was at great expense of human life and equipment. And the Senate Naval Affairs Committee, they held hearings and they wanted to know, is this going to continue the rest of the war? Is this what we can expect? Tarawa was the bloodiest fight in Marine Corps history to date. So, and Nimitz was receiving letters from grieving mothers saying, "You killed my son at Tarawa." So as a result of Tarawa, and I think I always talk about Tarawa because I think it illustrates so vividly how much the Navy was lacking in terms of knowledge of the ocean and just basic oceanographic knowledge, which is what Mary Sears always said. The Navy knew nothing about the ocean when they went to war. So after Tarawa, the Navy, the Janus reports were more aligned with the actual combat targets in the Pacific. So here's where Tarawa was, sort of at the beginning of the central campaign to get up here to Japan. And we had all these other places we needed to go, and we needed to know more about these islands. So the reports were done in a more timely fashion. They were aligned with the targets, the battle targets. And as a result, by the time the troops got to Okinawa, things were going much smoother, not only because we had better knowledge of the ocean, but the troops were more experienced. We had better equipment. The tractors, if they were needed to cross the reef, were like 3rd or 4th generation by then, and they were armored, and they could just speed the shore by that time. So Okinawa, as many of you know, was the last major amphibious battle of the Pacific campaign. And even though there were a lot of preparations done to invade Japan, that did not happen because of the atomic bombs that were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, forcing a surrender, unconditional surrender of the Japanese troops. Well, after the war, Mary Sears was given a commendation by Admiral Nimitz, and in which he said, "In your capacity of oceanographer, you were frequently called upon by the Joint Chiefs of Staff to furnish critically valuable information for use in combat operations. Your performance of all these duties was at all times exceptional and beyond the high standard normally expected." And this letter just really stood out to me because Mary Sears, here we have this woman at a time when there were not many women scientists and not many women in the military at all, who was furnishing critically valuable information for use in combat operations. This was almost unheard of. And Mary Sears, as we know, a lot of her duties were and activities were clandestine, and we may never know the true extent of all of her contributions during the war. But I made this list of the known ones, And first of all, she was the leader of the oceanographic unit. She was the secretary of the Joint Chiefs Subcommittee on Oceanography. She attended a second Joint Chiefs Committee, the Joint Intelligence Study Publishing Board meetings. She gathered oceanographic intelligence for the oceanography chapter of the Janus reports. She performed last-minute calculations in the middle of the night and made judgment calls for Pacific combat targets. She collaborated with counterparts in the British Hydrographic Office, and she was a liaison with Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution. So this is quite a list. And again, I'm not sure we know everything that Mary Sears was up to during the war, but she accomplished quite a bit and was very instrumental. Discussions were held after the war ended. Mary Sears was there for several more months, in which the decision was made to continue oceanography and to make it a division, in which Mary Sears was named the first military chief of it. After the war, Mary Sears went back to Woods Hole, where she spent the rest of her career. And she was very well known for a number of her activities there, not the least of which was filling out 250,000 index cards so that she could create a comprehensive oceanographic index. These times, at this point, there were no computers, and there really was no other way to keep track of the literature other than compiling indices. And so Mary Sears would fill out a card for every book, chapter, article that she read, and she would cross-reference it. And after the war, her index cards were published in 15 oversized volumes as one of the most comprehensive oceanographic indexes to date. She was also instrumental in helping to organize the field of oceanography. Mary Sears co-edited the first major journal of oceanography, Deep Sea Research, which was a very prestigious journal. And she also chaired the first International Congress on Oceanography, held in New York City in 1959. So she was doing all of this work behind the scenes to help ensure that the new scientific specialty of oceanography was recognized and formalized and became its own distinct field. This is a photograph I haven't shown before. This came from Mary Sears' papers, her collection. And this is Mary Sears right here. And it's from the Mount Holyoke, held a celebration for its 125th anniversary in 1962. And they awarded a number of honorary doctorates. And this Mary Sears got one, of course, in science. But also, this individual here is Harper Lee, author of To Kill a Mockingbird, and she was awarded a doctorate in literature. So that's kind of interesting. And after she retired, Mary Sears ultimately got on board a ship, and even though it was just a little sailboat that she called the Picaro, which is Spanish for seabird, and she sailed all around Woods Hole and was very well known around there. This is another legacy of Mary Sears' tenure at the Hydrographic Office. And this is the Naval Oceanographic Office, which today is called NAVOceano, and it is at the Stennis Space Center in Bay St. Louis, Mississippi. And I visited there recently, and I can tell you that they consider Mary Sears to be their patron saint. There is a portrait of her on the wall, and they all speak in very glowing terms about Mary Sears and her work in World War II. After Mary Sears' death, the Navy commissioned a ship, the USNS Mary Sears, and this is her sister Leela, who is christening her ship. on October 19th, 2000. And this is the USNS Mary Sears. I met several female oceanographers and male oceanographers who have sailed on the USNS Mary Sears and performed research projects for the Navy. So that was very special. I think it is somewhat ironic that a woman who was prohibited from sailing on scientific expeditions had a research vessel named after her. But Mary Sears clearly deserved the honor. And one can imagine if she had lived to see this USNS Mary Sears, she would have been both proud and amused by this occurrence. This concludes my presentation about Mary Sears and the marine scientists who helped win World War II. This is my book cover. And if anyone is interested in ordering a signed copy, this is a bookstore I work with here in Austin, or you can send me an email and I'll send you an order form or something. And if anyone has any questions or just wants to, throw out an interesting factoid about Mary Sears, please do get in touch. I hear from people all the time about Mary Sears and just saying the most wonderful things about her, people that have worked with her or people that just read the story and consider her a national hero. So I'll be happy to take your questions at any point.
Thank you so much, Catherine. This is wonderful. We have several questions that have been written in the chat box, and I'll help you with those. And some of them are my very same questions. And I thought it was interesting that one person asked a question and in your next sentence, you answered it. So that person said, never mind, already answered. That was about whether chapter 3 would have helped Janice, of the Janice reports would have helped at Tarawa. And you answered that. Yes, it would have. So may we start by asking you, how did you get interested in Mary Sears? How did you find out about her?
I came across some articles on the internet about Mary Sears. I wanted to write about World War II for my third book, because in my second book, which is called Hurt, it was a history of the injury care in this country. Mm-hmm. And the history of injury care in the United States parallels our involvement with wars. I started with the Civil War and kind of worked my way through the history. But when I got to World War II, it's just such a compelling event. And I tell you, when I was writing this book through COVID, partly, it just reminded me so much of World War II and what the national emergency for both, and how life-changing both World War II and COVID were to the American people. So I wanted to write about World War II, and I was starting to read about Mary Sears, and it was Veterans Day of 2017. I went home to Orange, Texas, and to talk to my dad, and he had never talked about the war. So he was 90 then. He had been a 17-year-old sailor in World War II. So I took his oral history of his naval service in World War II, and I found out that he had been at these places, many of these places that Mary Sears had provided intelligence for. He had been at the Battle of Peleliu, he had been at Okinawa, he had been in the occupation of Japan. And so that kind of cemented it for me that I wanted to go ahead and see if I could find out enough about this story to write about it.
Thank you. It's one person asked, why was she only a lieutenant? But it was actually a lieutenant commander. Is that right?
Right. And Mary stayed in the reserves, the naval reserves, after the war for several decades, and rose to the rank of commander. So that's pretty high rank for her time.
Right. Another person has asked if Mary Sears was hired at Woods Hole right out of Radcliffe, and did she have any other employment before entering the Navy?
Well, that's a good question, because so she was Henry Bryant Bigelow's research assistant, And
Right.
he actually wrote the grant, if you will, or the proposal for the Rockefeller Foundation to fund Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution while Mary was working with him. So she was sort of on the ground floor, and she was one of the initial research assistants at Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, and she continued her work there. But there was a period of time before the war where she also taught at, I believe it was Wellesley. And Bigelow wanted her to get some additional experience. So, but she never left Woods Hole. She had a house there. She continued to work with Bigelow even while she was lecturing at Wellesley.
Thank you. And then one person's asked if Mary Sears kept a journal, or how you were able to create the personal Mary Sears.
Well, you know, there was no journal. Boy, I wish there had been, but there wasn't. There was no journal. She did give 3 oral histories later in life, and I had all 3 of those. And I talked to people that knew Mary Sears, and she had lived with a woman and her husband who kind of became her caretakers later in life, and that's Wendy Nyes. And she shared a lot of stories about Mary Sears and other information. And I talked to just different people that knew her. And she didn't leave a journal, but she did attempt a few times what she called her memoirs. And they never really got very far, but some of it focused on World War II, which was also what I was focused on. So I just had to piece it together, and that's what I did.
And we do have one of her relatives still living in Wayland. And I know that person was at the christening of the USNS Mary Sears as well.
Yes.
Her Aunt Lila. One person asked, did she have 1 or 2 sisters? I think the answer is 2 from the 2 different families.
I think she actually had 3.
3. Oh, that's right, because there was a 3rd one. There were 3 children in the first marriage.
Yes.
The second, right?
I think so. It was Mary, Kit, and Edmund in the first marriage. And then there was John and Betsy in the second, John and Betsy in the second marriage, I believe.
And Lila.
Lila, right. John, Betsy, and Lila in the second marriage.
Yeah.
So 6 altogether.
Right. Okay, another question is anybody optioned the book for a film?
Boy, I wish they would.
Okay.
I haven't heard yet from anyone, but I think it would make a terrific movie. I just think there were so many interesting scenes with these people wandering around Washington, D.C., trying to get this last minute information, and at the same time trying to cover their tracks so that no one knew exactly what they were doing. So
another question is, did you find evidence of real discrimination by the men in the Navy against her specifically? Her colleagues.
I would say that I did not pinpoint any specific, what I would call sexism or discrimination against Mary Sears in the Navy. There was that policy at Woods Hole that prevented women from being on overnight expeditions, and that persisted into, I think, the early 60s. And Mary Sears did comment on that in one of her oral histories that, it did affect her career, her scientific career in terms of basic research. She didn't let that hold her back, however. She found other ways to contribute to the field, even though she couldn't go out and collect her own specimens. But, I think looking at it now, there's no question that policy affected her career.
And then the thing that I was really fascinated with, there were so many wonderful facts in this book, that things that I didn't know. I mean, little bits and pieces like the business about the gas rationing during the war. I just never realized that that was almost more associated with the amount of use that you would put on your tires of your car, because rubber was so impossible to get, more so than the actual gas. And there are lots and lots of facts in the book that are really enlightening about the times, which I really appreciate. And the other thing that I think that fortunately you did right up front on the first or second page was the map. And that was, I went back and forth to that map, and thank
great.
you for that. That was really good.
Great. I'm glad you like that.
So I think somebody else has a question here and I'm not seeing it. Are you seeing it, Courtney?
No, and I think we actually just lost her.
Oh, okay.
Uh-oh.
It
But,
looked like there was somebody that had a question and then
yeah,
they disappeared.
yeah.
Let's see, I think I've covered the ones that have come into the chat box.
Yeah, we could invite folks if they wanted to vocally share their question, they're welcome to, or raise their hand and I can allow them.
You
to
can do that. Okay.
Yeah.
So if anybody has a question that they'd like to talk to Catherine about, or just a comment, you're welcome to do so in your own voice or type it in. So. I thought that also, I mean, since nobody's saying anything yet, I was really interested in Mary Greer and her just wealth of knowledge and pulling together this bibliography of 2,900 sites. It was just amazing what she had to do, and then having to go all over the world to gather this information. And obviously kept a lot of it in her head.
You know, librarians were just super important in World War II because they were the keepers of information, and they still are to a great extent. But they were just invaluable in helping the intelligence agencies and the military and everybody else get the information they needed, because there was no computer, there was no internet, and information was not organized the way it is today. It just was not accessible. So people like Mary Greer were just invaluable.
Yeah, definitely. I definitely agree with that. But did she specialize then in oceanography?
Well, she worked, I believe her degree was in library science, but she worked at the University of Washington in the Department of Oceanography.
Okay.
For many years before she went to World War II. So she was considered, and Mary Sears gave her all the credit in the world in her oral histories and commented on her vast knowledge of oceanography.
Right. And I thought that was so interesting when you pointed out that they would need the information right away in the middle of the night. And so they'd send a runner out with this, exclusive information that they had to hide with a closed letter and knock on their doors. And they'd
right. Well, a lot of that was for Mary Sears. Some of these far-flung locations did not have published tide tables. So Mary Sears would have to extrapolate tide levels. At least this is what she spoke about in her oral history. She would have to do some calculations to give them the correct information.
But it had to be a secret of where it was.
They would make the decision at the last minute. That's right. It was a secret until the last minute. And because she was clear, she had the high enough intelligence clearance to do these calculations. She was the person asked to do them.
To do it, right. One person has asked which sources you did use at the Historical Society. That's a self-serving question, I guess. For us, I didn't.
Let me see if I can remember. I
Yeah.
remember having several documents. One of them was from Leela Sears and her
Uh-huh.
recollections about the family. And particularly about the father, when her father had become, when Mary Sears' father had was grieving her mother and had gone to Europe
Yeah.
for some untold period of time, and left Mary Sears and the other two in the care of friends and relatives, essentially, and caretakers. So I think Mary Sears developed a lot of her self-reliant qualities in early childhood.
Mhm. Yeah, because she was only 6 then.
She was only 6, and she was very clear about the fact that she helped take care of the family from an early age.
Wow, interesting.
Mhm.
Somebody has asked, did her sister also work for the government in decoding? Well, her sister Lila was the town clerk here in Wayland for 25 years, so that's a government thing, but I don't know about decoding. Do you have anything?
Yes, she did.
Okay.
Lila was in the cryptology unit, and she reported a memory that she met Admiral Nimitz during the war,
Oh,
and that he noticed that her name tag said Sears on it, and said to Lila, you know, one day the world will know how much your sister has done for the Navy. And it's interesting, and several people have written to me to say that Admiral Nimitz was not in Washington, D.C. During World War II, that he was headquartered in Hawaii. But I just read a new book about Nimitz by naval historian Craig Simmons, and he documents several trips to Washington, D.C. that Nimitz took. And of course, he would be there for at least a week at a time, because it was so far from Hawaii to Washington. So I think it's quite feasible that he met with Leela during the war and said this.
excellent. Excellent. Well, I know that you have another engagement, and if there is no one else with any questions.
Gretchen, I see one more.
Okay.
Did Mary ever marry? How long did she live, and where is she buried?
Mary is buried in Woods Hole. I believe she lived to 92. She did not marry. And what she said in her oral histories was that at the time that she went into science, a woman had to choose whether she was going to have a family or whether she was going to have a career. And she was absolutely right, because if women were married at that time, employers were very suspect that they would leave if they got pregnant or prioritize their family. They didn't know what to expect from women scientists. So I have seen this time and again, that women that chose a profession at that time did not marry.
Right. And yes, she was 92 because she was born in 1905.
Right.
And passed away in 1997.
Right. Correct.
That was great. Well,
Well,
go ahead.
These have just been some great questions, and I was hoping to get some of these personal questions from the people in Wayland and around Wayland. And I think you have a lot to be proud of, that this person, Mary Sears, was born and raised in your hometown and served the Navy so well during World War II.
Well, I think it does make it a little bit more exciting for us. I mean, I certainly, I've been telling everybody about it.
Great.
They're looking at me like, oh, okay, well, maybe I'll try it. But at any rate, it's definitely is
Absolutely
more compelling, I think, to us from the area. Is there one more question here? Is there a memorial for her in Wayland? I'd have to say that the answer is no. The house still exists where she was raised on Pelham Island Road. And it's known to many as the Sears house because, in fact, it went to Edmund's son, Edmund, and her brother's son, and they lived there for many years. So.
Yeah, I don't know of any memorials. I hope some come about as a result of this book, or renaming something for Mary Sears. Maybe
Mhm.
they'll name some naval office, but it's a pretty big deal to have a U.S. Naval
Yes.
survey ship named after you. And the type that Mary, there only one woman has been named for this type of ship, so that's a pretty big deal.
And she was the first, is that correct?
This
The only-
particular type of ship, she is the only woman.
Only woman, yeah.
Yeah, the Pathfinder series. So I think
Fantastic.
that's
Right.
pretty neat. That's a pretty great honor. But I hope there's some memorials that crop up soon.
Great idea. I mean, I hadn't really thought of it.
Absolutely, great idea.
So thank you so much, Catherine. You've done a great job.
Thank
And we wish you best of luck with the book, and we will continue to tell people about it, and
Great.
that you've got a couple of more engagements in the Boston area. So keep it up.
Okay, thank you so much for this privilege.
Oh, well, thank you. And if we find out any more information about grade school, we will definitely let you know.
That would be wonderful.
We'll search it up. Thanks, Courtney, for organizing us.
Thank you.
Righty.